The effects of the Black Death had not yet subsided, and the graves of millions of its victims were scarcely closed, when a strange delusion arose in Germany, which took possession of the minds of men, and, in spite of the divinity of our nature, hurried away body and soul into the magic circle of hellish superstition. It was a convulsion which in the most extraordinary manner infuriated the human frame, and excited the astonishment of contemporaries for more than 2 centuries, since which time it has never reappeared. It was called the Dance of St. John or of Saint Vitus, on account of the bacchantic leaps by which it was characterized, and which gave to those affected, whilst performing their wild dance, and screaming and foaming with fury, all the appearance of persons possessed. It did not remain confined to particular localities, but was propagated by the sight of the sufferers, like a demoniacal epidemic, over the whole of Germany and the neighboring countries to the northwest, which were already prepared for its reception by the prevailing opinions of the time. It was but a few months ere this demoniacal disease had spread from Aix-la-Chapelle, where it appeared in July, 1374 over the neighboring Netherlands. In Liege, Utrecht, Tongres, and many other towns of Belgium, the dancers appeared with garlands in their hair. In towns and villages they took possession of the religious houses, processions were everywhere instituted on their account, and masses were said and hymns were sung, while the disease itself, of the demoniacal origin of which no one entertained the least doubt, excited everywhere astonishment and horror. In Liege the priests had recourse to exorcisms, and endeavored by every means in their power to allay an evil which threatened so much danger to themselves, for the possessed assembling in multitudes, frequently poured forth imprecations against them, and menaced their destruction. So early as the year 1374, assemblages of men and women were seen at Aix-la-Chapelle, and who, united by one common delusion, exhibited to the public both in the streets and in the churches the following strange spectacle. They formed circles hand in hand, and appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing, regardless of the bystanders, for hours together, in wild delirium, until at length they fell to the ground in a state of exhaustion. They then complained of extreme oppression, and groaned as if in the agonies of death, until they were swathed in cloths bound tightly round their waists, upon which they again recovered, and remained free from complaint until the next attack. This practice of swathing was resorted to on account of the painful swelling of the bowels, which followed these spasmodic ravings, but the bystanders frequently relieved patients in a less artificial manner, by thumping and trampling upon the parts affected. While dancing they neither saw nor heard, being insensible to external impressions through the senses, but were haunted by visions, their fancies conjuring up spirits whose names they shrieked out, and some of them afterwards asserted that they felt as if they had been immersed in a stream of blood, which obliged them to leap so high. The personal history of Saint Vitus is by no means important in this matter. He was a Sicilian youth, who, together with Modestius and Crescentia, suffered martyrdom at the time of the persecution of the Christians, under Diocletian, in the year 303. The legends respecting him are obscure, and he would certainly have been passed over without notice among the innumerable apocryphal martyrs of the first centuries, had not the transfer of his body to St. Denis, and thence, in the year 836, to Corvey, raised him to a higher rank. From this time forth it may be supposed that many miracles were manifested at his new sepulchre, which were of essential service in confirming the Roman faith among the Germans. As the worship of these saints was at that time stripped of all historical connections, which were purposely obliterated by the priesthood, a legend was invented that Saint Vitus had, just before he bent his neck to the sword, prayed to God that he might protect from the Dancing Mania all those who should solemnize the day of his commemoration, and that thereupon a voice from heaven was heard, saying, "Vitus, thy prayer is accepted." Thus Saint Vitus became the patron saint of those afflicted with the dancing plague. The connection which John the Baptist had with the Dancing Mania of the 14th century, was of a totally different character. He was originally far from being a protecting saint to those who were attacked, or one who would be likely to give them relief from a malady considered as the work of the devil. On the contrary, the manner in which he was worshipped afforded an important and very evident cause for its development. From the remotest period, perhaps even so far back as the 4th century, St. John's Day was solemnized with all sorts of strange and rude customs, of which the originally mystical meaning was variously disfigured among different nations by superadded relics of heathenism. Thus the Germans transferred to the festival of St. John's Day an ancient heathen usage, the kindling of the Nodfer, which was forbidden them by St. Boniface. And the belief probably subsists even to the present day that people and animals that have leapt through these flames, or their smoke, are protected for a whole year from fevers and other diseases, as if by a kind of baptism by fire. Bacchanalian dances, which have originated in similar causes among all the rude nations of the earth, and the wild extravagancies of a heated imagination, were the constant accompaniments of this half-heathen, half-Christian festival. At the period of which we are treating, however, the Germans were not the only people who gave way to the ebullitions of fanaticism in keeping the festival of St. John the Baptist. Similar customs were also to be found among the nations of southern Europe and of Asia, and it is more than probable that the Greeks transferred to the festival of John the Baptist, a part of their bacchanalian mysteries, an absurdity of a kind which is but too frequently met with in human affairs. At the Highland Beltane in Scotland, a cake was divided by lot, and whoever drew the burnt piece was obliged to leap 3 times over the flames. At the midsummer bonfires in Ireland all passed through the fire, the men when the flames were highest, the women when they were lower, and the cattle when there was nothing left but smoke. It is only of importance here to add that in Abyssinia, a country entirely separated from Europe, John is worshipped, as protecting saint of those who are attacked with the dancing malady. In these fragments of the dominion of mysticism and superstition, historical connection is not to be found. When we observe, however, that the first dancers in Aix-la-Chapelle appeared in July with St. John's name in their mouths, the conjecture is probable that the wild revels of St. John's Day, 1374, gave rise to this mental plague. This is rendered so much the more probable because some months previously the districts in the neighborhood of the Rhine and the Main had met with great disasters. So early as February, both these rivers had overflowed their banks to a great extent, the walls of the town of Cologne, on the side next the Rhine, had fallen down, and a great many villages had been reduced to the utmost distress. To this was added the miserable condition of western and southern Germany. Neither law nor edict could suppress the incessant feuds of the barons, and in Franconia especially, the ancient times of club law appeared to be revived. Security of property there was none, arbitrary will everywhere prevailed, corruption of morals and rude power rarely met with even a feeble opposition, whence it arose that the cruel, but lucrative, persecutions of the Jews were in many places still practiced through the whole of this century with their wonted ferocity. Thus, throughout the western parts of Germany, and especially in the districts bordering on the Rhine, there was a wretched and oppressed populace, and if we take into consideration that among their numerous bands many wandered about, whose consciences were tormented with the recollection of the crimes which they had committed during the prevalence of the Black Plague, we shall comprehend how their despair sought relief in the intoxication of an artificial delirium. There is hence good ground for supposing that the frantic celebration of the festival of St. John, 1374, only served to bring to a crisis a malady which had been long impending. If we would further inquire how a hitherto harmless usage, which like many others had but served to keep up superstition, could degenerate into so serious a disease, we must take into account the unusual excitement of medieval minds, and the consequences of wretchedness and want. This extraordinary disease was, however, so greatly mitigated by the 16th century that the St. John's dancers had long since ceased to stroll from town to town. Moreover, most of those affected were only annually visited by attacks, and the occasion of them was so manifestly referable to the prevailing notions of that period, that if the unqualified belief in the supernatural agency of saints could have been abolished, they would not have had any return of the complaint. Throughout the whole of June, prior to the festival of St. John, patients felt a disquietude and restlessness which they were unable to overcome. They were dejected, timid, and anxious, wandered about in an unsettled state, being tormented with twitching pains, which seized them suddenly in different parts, and eagerly expected the eve of St. John's Day, in the confident hope that by dancing at the altars of this saint, they would be freed from all their sufferings. This hope was not disappointed, and they remained, for the rest of the year, exempt from any further attack, after having thus, by dancing and raving for 3 hours, satisfied an irresistible demand of nature.